Welcome to the Healing Motherhood podcast. This is your host, Alexis Stearns, and today I'm going to shed some light on something that people really don't talk about. So I want to invite you to just imagine for a moment this moment of immense vulnerability, anticipation, a moment that should be filled with joy and love, but instead turns into an experience that lingers heavy and sad and almost feels like sickness deep within you. Today we're diving into a topic that remains pushed down, silenced, yet affects countless mothers worldwide. It is the unspoken aftermath of birth trauma. Birth trauma affects between 30 and the newest numbers are saying up to 45% of new parents. That is a lot of people experiencing birth trauma each year. So I think it's really important for us to have a clear understanding of what birth trauma is and what it looks like, and even some of the ways in which it impacts our lives. Today, we're just talking about a few of those things, and in the coming days and weeks, we will dive even deeper into each part of the causes of birth trauma, the impacts of birth trauma, and then the impacts of healing birth trauma. It's a hidden burden that often goes unrecognized, but it holds the power to shape not just the moments after birth or even the labor or the pregnancy, but the very essence of motherhood itself. It has this impact that lingers in a way that many survivors don't appreciate. Birth trauma is what started me on my healing journey. So today we're unraveling the subtle threads of unresolved birth trauma, exploring how it can quietly shape your emotions, your parenting journey, and even your family dynamics. The story doesn't have to end with this deep sadness, this experience that lingers deep within, right? That's not the end of the story. In fact, I'm here to share with you not just my story, but the story of countless survivors of birth trauma who have peeled back the layers and healed what is beneath the surface. So let's talk about what birth trauma is. Birth trauma is anything perceived to have been traumatic by the person giving birth. This can occur anywhere from preconception all the way through postpartum. And postpartum is really anytime after having a baby. But in general, we consider postpartum up to 2 years after having a baby, even though the impacts of having a baby go much further than that. So we talked about it being perceived as traumatic by the parent. We talked about it being any time from preconception through postpartum. And now the last part of it is that it causes some kind of interruption in your life afterwards. This could be symptoms of PTSD. So a few signs that somebody has experienced birth trauma. This is what we're looking for when we're talking about birth trauma. And these signs would be a good hint that maybe there's something worth looking into. So the first one is intrusion. Intrusion can be something like flashbacks or nightmares where you are literally re-experiencing in your brain the traumatic event. Okay, so this is like when you close your eyes and you literally feel like you are there, or when you smell something or hear something and your body all of a sudden feels like it is back in that traumatic event. Okay? So that's flashbacks, dreams, and other intrusive thoughts that interrupt or distract you in your life, right? These are, intrusive thoughts are super common. But when we are talking about them interrupting your life, it is like you have an intrusive thought and you are stuck in that thought. You cannot move forward. You're almost paralyzed by it. Okay? Another sign would be avoidance, using avoidance behaviors. And this can include, rerouting your drive to work so that you don't drive past the hospital that you gave birth in. It could be avoiding a part of the house where you experienced prenatal or even trauma in labor. It could be avoiding things that may trigger memories of the birth. This includes things like TV shows, Facebook posts, when you see Facebook posts from friends saying that they're pregnant or that they just had a baby, and it brings up all of these icky feelings. And before we move on to the next sign, I just want to say a lot of people kind of poo-poo on avoidance as though it is this awful thing. But the truth is avoidance is there for a reason. And you don't necessarily want to push yourself not to avoid these things without proper support. Avoidance is a very useful coping mechanism to get us through, especially the early time after a traumatic experience. The next one is arousal. And arousal refers to kind of feeling this heightened sense of threat. And sometimes we call it hyperarousal. And then there's also hypoarousal, where we're kind of like in a freeze state. But what I'm talking about here is this hyperarousal, where we are feeling a heightened sense of threat, right? Everything feels like danger. Handing my baby to my mother-in-law, for my mother-in-law to hold the baby while I shower, feels like danger. It can look kind of like what we think of as anxiety. It can look like an exaggerated startle response to different noises throughout the house. It can look like a general sense of irritability, right? If we are constantly looking out for danger, we are going to be a little bit more irritable from being on all of the time. And then the next big one is mood and beliefs. So this would encompass things like negative thoughts or feelings, maybe about your partner, maybe about your baby, maybe about yourself. And this is when those are having a negative overall impact on your life, right? Everybody, part of being a human is having a wide array of human emotions. But when we are feeling anger, for example, most of the time, and it's impacting our relationships, it's impacting how we're able to take care of ourselves, how we're able to take care of our child, that is when it is showing us that this is a big thing that needs addressed, right? So all of these kind of signs of birth trauma can have a big impact on our relationship with ourselves, on our relationship with our partner, with our family members who are trying to hopefully trying to help with our baby, right? And it has been found to impact that bond with baby. So lots of impacts from birth trauma itself. When we talk about those impacts like bonding, we can also see ways that birth trauma impacts the interactions and the feelings of safety from interactions with family members, right? It's in the subtle comments that your mom makes or your dad makes after that birth experience that can feel, you're already on high alert, like we talked about with that hyperarousal. And so it can make all of our different relationships feel more dangerous than they may or may not be, right? And that's not to belittle any things that you don't want from those family members, right? Because we all have toxic traits and we all have family members that have toxic traits that, we may or may not be willing to tolerate, especially in the postpartum period. The impacts of birth trauma reach far and wide, and we will dive into those. But for this next week, we're really going to dive into the 4 themes of birth trauma by Dr. Cheryl Beck. And that will kind of give us a basis as we're starting to get to know each other in this space. And it will allow us to dive a little bit more deeply into each of the 4 ways that birth trauma is created. As we have journeyed through kind of the depths of this hidden burden that birth trauma creates, one thing is really important to remember. That my mission through this podcast is to help you learn to heal, to take ownership of your healing, and to see that healing is possible for you. Just like it's possible for me, it is also possible for you. The subtle signs, the lingering emotions, they don't have to define your motherhood experience. And you're taking the first step now by recognizing these signs and even naming it. If you have had a traumatic birth, is one step towards taking the power of that birth trauma away and helping take ownership of your future from here on out. The path to healing can be challenging, but it's also beautiful. So I'd like to invite you to follow along. Hit subscribe so that you're notified of each and every episode coming out, where we're going to dive even deeper into one little part, because there's so many parts of birth trauma and there are so many parts of healing motherhood. So hit subscribe, use the link down below to get a free resource to start you on finding safety to start having these conversations, to start to breathe and come back just a tiny step into your body while we discuss healing in motherhood. Thank you so much for being here today.